Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Ivo, for inviting me to give a talk on reducing technical debt with reproducible containers. This is work done under a Better Scientific Software Fellowship. A little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Computing at DePaul University, and my primary research interest is in data provenance. And I'm exploring how provenance can be useful for computational reproducibility. In general, I'm interested in building data management systems for scientific data. And today I'll be presenting one of those systems, PSI Unit, for computational reproducibility. But before I present PSI Unit, let us ask the question, what is technical debt? So we all are familiar with some fiscal debt on commodities, such as a house, a car, or a credit card. Now, a fiscal debt is a weight or a burden that we choose to carry to meet an objective. Often taking on that debt to buy the dream house not only gets us the house faster, it is cheaper than the alternative of continuing to rent. Technical debt, introduced by Ward Cunningham in 1992, is no different. To be clear, in science and academia, the commodity is often the paper, and since research is mostly computational, it increasingly includes the software accompanying the paper. So in technical debt, over time, the paper review process, based on the various deadlines, submission, rebuttal, camera-ready deadline, helps us improve the quality of the paper. But there are no similar deadlines for the software that accompanies the paper. So it is our intention to write good scientific software, but in the end, we end up writing poor scientific software, thus accumulating technical debt over the period of time. Now, software engineers have tried to qualify this technical debt. They've tried to determine the dimensions of this technical debt, such as poor quality code, poor design, not knowing the environment. So you are writing a scientific software, but the software's environment has not been completely known. There is lack of documentation, or they are missing tests in the software. Researchers are, the software engineering researchers have also strongly suggested that technical debt must be paid over time. But what if we don't? Now, if we contrast it with the fiscal debt situation, there are consequences of mismanaged debt. If the debt is not repaid, then the commodity gets confiscated. So should a paper be retracted if technical debt on its software is not paid? Well, increasingly, this is becoming true. In conference publications, the paper is being termed irreproducible by conferences. So how can we pay technical debt with minimal investment of time? And that is the topic of sort of my today's talk, where I'm proposing that we need something like a notion of a reproducible container. And the idea is that it's a container system, so it gets your dependencies. Containers have become very popular in DevOps, but we need to make them useful for reproducible science so that we can pay technical debt with as little human intervention as possible. Now, in today's talk, I'm going to lay the vision of such a container, and I'm sort of going to focus on two kinds of debt: the environment debt and the documentation debt. Now, before I begin my discussion about reproducible containers, for a moment, let's talk about containers such as Docker and Singularity. Now, as most of you might be knowing, that containers provide secure resource isolation. So we have resources such as CPU, memory, file system, network, and as you can see, these green, yellow, and blue lines, the resource gets isolated into a specific quantity. So you can say, well, 200% of the CPU, 20% of the CPU is allocated to a given application, another 40% is allocated to another, and another 50%. So you can allocate your resource based on C groups, and then all the programs for that particular application remain constrained within that isolated environment. But containers do not help us pay technical debt. They do not address the issues of technical debt. In particular, the environment debt must be paid manually. So if you look at our containers like Docker and Singularity, they require programmatic description of dependencies. One has to program a Docker file to tell what must be contained within the container. And within that, we also have, the user also has to specify the specific library versions that the application is using. Not only that, once the container is created, there is no guarantee that that container only contains files that are necessary for that application. The application may consist of anything irrelevant as well. And none of these containers are ever documented. Like the way GitHub repositories are documented. You'll have a README or something, but you don't see such kind of READMEs for Docker images, for instance. So the reproducible containers are aiming to address some of these issues that are there in regular containers, trying to introduce methods within the specific container so that there is less and less programmatic need. There's less and less need for documentation. So I'm going to introduce the first topic for this, which is the programmatic encapsulation. And the project that we have for programmatic encapsulation is called the PSI Unit. What PSI Unit basically does is create what we say as the reusable research object. So the key idea in the PSI Unit is to observe an application execution and use the trace to encapsulate the application data dependencies. Now, these application data dependencies could be binaries, could be data and system dependencies, could be environment configuration, and create a provenance graph, which can be used for describing the application itself. So the fundamental thing is that, well, when you are creating a container, you're describing the content, the application in some specific terms, often in terms of packages or repositories that must be included within the container. So here in PSI Unit, the key idea is, well, why don't we just observe the application, observe its execution, and if the application must be using all the files that it needs, and if we can just containerize them, just at that time determine what the dependencies are and put them in a container, well, that's where our container would be automatically ready. So in PSI Unit, the first phase is encapsulation. The idea is, again, as I said, to observe the application through application virtualization mechanisms, and we use ptrace, LDD, looking at all the dependencies that an application has, and copy those dependencies into a self-contained a directory where the directory hierarchy is maintained exactly as it would have been in the host system of a user, for instance, Alice over here. So Alice has a host system over here, and that exact host system is created within a directory on Alice's computer. So you get an encapsulation of the application, and then this encapsulation can be moved on to Bob's computer, for instance, and a simple replay of that application could be is done by redirecting the calls, again observing the calls that are being made to the target file system and the target OS of Bob's computer. And instead of making those calls, such as a change directory over here or open over here, the calls are redirected into that encapsulation system. So this can be done by mechanisms such as change root. You can also do it like that without needing containerization as such. Little bit details more that while we are observing, we also capture its provenance graph, and we create this directory structure. So over here, Alice is using the file system, and the file system is exactly created over here. But we create a container as such, in the sense that when the application is rerun, it's run in an isolated manner. That means it's run in its own namespace. Before we start the application, we isolate the application, its CPU, we isolate the network namespace, and so it's run. The new application is run kind of the container style. So it's not exactly a Docker container. We don't use Docker, but by introducing isolation right when the application starts, the application is isolated. Now, once the application is isolated, the one may say, well, the entire application is isolated. Why do we need to redirect the calls back to? Why do we need a redirection again? Because the entire application is isolated. Well, there are further motivations for reproducibility that we need to also verify that exactly same files are being accessed, and do a provenance graph matching of what the original execution was, and the new execution is matching with the original execution. And if it is not, then save it certain guarantees that it is not matching. So I'm not going to be going into the details for how the provenance graph matching happens. I'll be we're talking about technical debt, so I'll continue to focus. And there are other papers that I have which talk about the provenance graph matching problem while redirecting. So here is a sample interaction of PSI Unit. We can create a PSI Unit over here, for instance, in FIE. So FIE is just a name of a PSI Unit. It works very much like a Git repository. And you run your application, for instance, a shell script, which is reading an input data file. It's running the application. Well, just by running that application, the PSI Unit is created. So you can list that PSI Unit, you can show the details about that PSI Unit, you can push it on the cloud, you can copy it to another machine, you'll get an identifier, and then the other user can just use this identifier to download the PSI Unit and repeat it. So now this execution is being repeated within the container by isolating that computation without it being run just in the native target system. And there are other features that we have added, such that you can change the process, or you can change the data file with which you are running a given execution, just to introduce more levels of repeatability, such as changing data files. Now, this whole thing is programming language independent. We have tested on multiple programming languages like Python, C, C++, Fortran, Julia. So all these, and we've sort of tested the PSI units that are created again into on Exceed and on Cloud Lab. So this helps us, as you can see, just this observation helps us take care of the environment debt. And now I'd like to sort of, given the time I have, present how we take care of the documentation debt. And the system over here is the DepGen. It provides dependency and data enumeration. So let me introduce a little example over here. So here is, a scientific code which is associated with a paper, and it's known as the SUMA model. It's a computational model in hydrology. And as you can see, this is the GitHub repository for it. And here I have tried to zoom in on the documentation. Now it says how to run local PySUMA locally. Well, you need to have all these dependencies for it. So our question is that can we actually generate this automatically? We already have the PSI unit, and somebody actually had SAS by SUMA running. So can we actually generate this README file automatically for them, because we have observed. So if you remember, I said that while we are running the application, we are already observing how the application is accessing various kinds of files through a provenance log. So these logs are created by tracing the system calls to the file system, and they are of the form that, well, you're reading this file, you're writing this file, and so on. So these can be helpful for us to determine that, what particular packages have been used. The only problem is that if you look at these logs, they are in terms of files, right? Whereas if we are documenting over here, they are in terms of packages. So how can we turn the information in these files, which is exactly at the file level, to something at the package level? So the container log consists of paths to individual files. We need to identify, well, what are these? Are these input files? Are these output files? Are these process files, right? Any process that might be running also is a file. Or is it a system dependency? And if it's a system dependency, what particular package it belongs to? So that is essentially the automatic container documentation problem, which is, can we identify packages from container logs? That is, establish the mapping between the specification of a file name with an established package name. Now, it turns out that this is not a very easy problem to solve. Different programming languages have different file paths for packages, and they have different mechanisms also of asking the files. What will apply for Java does not apply for Python. But what we have been able to find are consistent patterns that can be identified across languages. So that is essentially the function of DepGen. What it does is it looks at the container log. So once you have created a PSI unit, you'll get a log along with that. The DepGen is the circle over here. It identifies what are the inputs, outputs, processes, and dependencies. And it creates documentation. And from that documentation, we are hoping that we can create a Docker file, which we have done for the sample cases that we have experimented with. So determining inputs, outputs, and processes are easy. We have a graph. Anything which has no ingoing edges is an input, no outgoing edges is output. Processes are with edge-to-edge node. There is it's a direct fork relationship or an exact relationship which we can monitor. The issue with these log files are filtering noise. There is a lot of activity which is happening within interpreters and compilers, where they are simply checking whether a package is existing or not. So we need to remove those files, because a check does not mean that the package was actually used, was actually read, or its files were actually read by the package. So even if we remove this noise, we still cannot say that, well, this file is from a specific package, because the file names do not typically correspond to a package name. So a package name may not even appear in a given file name. So there we use the standard querying mechanisms, which luckily come along with multiple package repositories. So for Python, you can use pip search, and for R, you can use the query CRAN on the website to determine, well, a given file belongs to which particular package. Now, this is a very slow process. We need we realized that actually generating a documentation can be roughly a 10 to 15-minute long job. So we do not want that, and so we build an internal database so that we can continuously, if we have queried for a given file, we don't query it again. So here is a result for the previous experiment that I showed you. This is for the PySumma. So as you can see, there are lots of packages that DebGen reports. DebGen reports, well, any Python built-in packages. DebGen reports sub-packages that might be packages that are already present in the packages that a user is going to install. So here are the packages that were listed in that GitHub repository that I mentioned. And we only identified these packages over here. In fact, Seaborn and Jupyter themes were internal packages to the identified packages. So nobody had to explicitly install Seaborn or the Jupyter themes. So we repeated this experiment on a large number of scientific use cases. We looked at about 100 of these artifacts, mostly on GitHub and Zenodo. As it turned out, not many of them could be PSI unitized. Like, we couldn't observe the application execution. We couldn't get them to run. Some of them are missing something, which is actually in the source code, or the source code actually fails to run. And if that is there, obviously those repositories are not useful. That's one indication that one needs something like a reusable research object, so that when you download them, there's a guarantee that they can be run. Only 20 of them we could run, and we could contain them in PSI Unit. Where the dependencies were not listed, we ran them in our own virtual machine, and we installed our own packages. We use two metrics, precision and recall. In recall, we are looking at how many packages the user listed on the documentation and how many did we identify. And in precision, we are looking at the total identified packages, like, how many we identified quite a few, and how many of them were actually listed by the user. How many identified packages were mentioned in the documentation. So we sort of see what is the quality of DebGen. So here is a result from Zenodo research objects. These are all scientific use cases. We in this paper, we have the GitHub links, the Zenodo links to all of these projects. As you can see, the precision is not one. Not all the user listed packages, the identified packages are less. So the user is often overquoting the amount of packages. Those many packages do not need to be there, because if you look at the identified packages, most of those packages have to be, they're sub packages essentially. So if you look at the precision, how many packages we mentioned and how many we could identify, the precision is less than 1. So we are identifying a lot of packages, but some of them are the identified packages. Over here, we are seeing that the recall is 1 over here for these examples, and the reason for them being 1 is that actually they did not have any documentation. So instead of saying that the user listed packages is 0, we have mentioned that it's 1 because we could actually install them. We could get them to run. So it was really useful for half of them to actually automatically generate the documentation for them. So here's the summary, that the technical debt is inevitable while developing scientific software. I really encourage you to go back to the Parker paper. It's too short a time to present the whole thing and the some very interesting results that we have. So I'd like to conclude over here. The technical debt is inevitable while developing scientific software. Unpaid technical debt affects reproducibility of scientific claims. and the technical debt of encapsulating dependencies and the documentation of dependencies is something that we are showing is tractable. There are two methods that we are using, PSI Unit and DebtGen, and I encourage you to go to this website, psiunit.run, for more results. Well, thank you, everyone. This is acknowledged to the Exascale Computing Project, PSSW Fellowship, and NSF for these funds. So thank you, everyone. And these are my collaborators and the student.